This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. Now, when I started this podcast, there is absolutely no way I expected to be going down a path like I'm going to go down today. Even though it kind of feels related to what I do, unexpected, completely unexpected. My guest today is Safi Bahcall. His new book, Loonshots, How to Nurture the Crazy Ideas That Win Wars, Cure Diseases, and Transform Industries. Yeah, he connects all those dots. Very cool. As he might say, why did traffic jams appear from nowhere? What do James Bond and Lipitor have in common? What can we learn about human nature and world history from a glass of water? Safi goes a very surprising, novel way about thinking about the mysteries of group behavior that challenges everything we've ever thought about or known about nurturing radical breakthroughs. This is just cool stuff. It's a cool way to think. Without any further delay, let's jump right into my conversation with Safi Bahcall and his new book, Loonshots. In thinking about our conversation today, the first place that I have to start is your childhood. Because you know, there's not many people who grow up with a mom and a dad who are both physicists, who both have Wikipedia pages. Now, the Wikipedia page is somewhat recent, but still, this is a lot of interesting perspectives. Now, the biggest thing that I want to ask about it, I want you to give some color or any interesting experience, but you must have been a kid who was allowed to be a skeptic.
Yeah, I guess I never really thought about that. I think being a scientist is a mindset, and it's a mindset of looking at the world around you and asking why and how. Having two parents that were scientists, that definitely instills those values. So you go around looking at the world and saying, wow, that's amazing. I wonder why that happens. I wonder how that happens. And those are the kinds of discussions that both my dad and my mom encouraged me, and we still do. My mom was actually just here visiting us in Cambridge, Massachusetts, just this weekend. And we still have those discussions. You know, why do you think this happens? How does that happen? It's kind of fun. It's kind of fun to go around the world and say, that's kind of amazing. You know, when you're driving along a road, you see these sort of, it looks kind of liquid. If, you're driving down a road and there's the sun on the horizon and it seems like the road is shimmering. Well, why is that? Why does it look like a pool? And then you get these kind of fun discussions. So you develop this mindset of looking around the world and asking why.
You said kind of fun. It's just fun.
It is fun. I think that's right. It is fun. It just gives you a different way of, rather than this is good or this is bad, you just say, that's interesting. I wonder why.
Now, is there an early memory or a story or an anecdote that you can share growing up with two parents with such interesting backgrounds and interesting educational backgrounds? Is there anything that you might want to share that, sticks out for you that, because you went down a similar path in some ways. So, at least becoming a physicist, a lot of more entrepreneurial aspects in your life, but is there something that you'd like to share? Look, everyone's got an interesting life, but, I'm curious because I'm talking to you now.
There's a story that I think it was, is it Arabi who won the Nobel Prize in physics a long time ago once said about how he grew up. And it just reminded me something about how I grew up. And I think it might have been some reporter that asked him about, what do you attribute your success in science to? And he said, well, when I was a kid and I came home from school, my mom never asked me, what did you learn today? She asked me, did you ask any good questions today? And my childhood was kind of like that, too. We always talked about interesting questions. And I think if you focus on interesting questions rather than interesting answers, it teaches you a lot. It's less about, learning and building up your brain and building up your critical thinking. It's less about memorizing facts and understanding A and B. The world works through A and B and not C and D, but it's more about getting into a mindset of asking interesting questions. And if you keep asking interesting questions, you'll really tease out a lot of good stuff. And I think that applies not only in science, but in business and in personal stuff too. In business, there's so many companies or teams that, get exposed to the same idea and then reject them right away. And it's only a few companies or teams that will pursue some crazy idea. And usually that's because there's some reason that every conventional wisdom that everybody accepts that some idea isn't going to work. And the people who do really well keep asking, why is it so likely? Why is that true? And I'll give you an example. When Mark Zuckerberg first took around Facebook as an investment, it was kind of, in some sense, like a tail end of social networks. It wasn't the first social network. It was the 15th or 20th. There had been dozens of them. And right around that time, there was a social network called Friendster that had grown and then was starting to fail, and people were leaving it and jumping to the next one, which was at the time called MySpace. And so most investors said, well, this social network stuff sucks. It's just like a clothing fad. People will try one on and then they'll switch after 6 months. And, just like a pair of jeans, they'll just switch. They'll switch every few months. And so almost everybody passed except for one small group of investors, which said, really? Why is it like a clothing fad? Is that really the case? So that was actually Peter Thiel and a friend of mine who was working with him at the time. And they knew Friendster pretty well. They had friends back at that company. And they said, why are people really leaving this Friendster? Let's dig into that. And they got actually the retention records. And they were stunned by what they saw. They knew that Friendster, they knew that Friendster had these software glitches. It wasn't really working very well and the website was very slow. But they saw that people were staying on that site for an enormously long time. They were spending hours on that site despite all those ridiculous software glitches. So they realized it wasn't a problem with the business model. It was a computer bug. They just had software glitches. They knew that the company had gotten some advice about how to build a better and more scalable system to go from a few thousand users to a few million users and hadn't really implemented those changes. So they realized that everybody was kind of wrong, that it wasn't like a clothing fad. It wasn't a bad business model. So Peter Thiel at the time wrote him a check for $500,000 and 8 years later sold that for $1 billion. So the mindset of keep asking why and keep asking good questions can be a very valuable mindset in business.
To use a little terminology from you, what Thiel knew about Friendster is that it was a false fail.
Exactly. That's right. You read the book. Good
Oh,
for you.
come on. Oh my gosh. So bad, so rough. I'm already catching it from the guest. This is a tough. Okay. But why don't you explain what that is, though? Put your best professorial hat on and let the audience understand where you're coming from.
What I talk about is that although there's this idea that the progress is made by declaring these big moonshots and these big important goals, in reality, a lot of progress, whether in society or whether in businesses, come from these neglected ideas, these loonshots that have often been sitting around for years, if not decades, and their champions are written off as nuts. And that's all sorts of businesses.
You might want to define the word, because we haven't even used it yet. The word loon, like lunatic, L-O-O-N, I assume, right?
That's right. That's right. The easiest way to define it is by example. The original moonshot in 1961, John F. Kennedy declared, to Congress, we're going to put a man on the moon. And that was the original moonshot, because obviously we're going to put a man on the moon. And that's come to be used, that term moonshot, as anytime a big central authority declares a goal that's widely expected to have great significance. But if you look at how we got there, if you rewind the tape 5 decades, around 1920, the person who actually developed the idea for how we would get there was Robert Goddard, who came up with this crazy idea called jet propulsion, a rocket. And at the time, he was widely ridiculed. Kennedy, with his moonshot, was widely applauded. Goddard was widely ridiculed. Even the New York Times published a story that, well, there's this professor in physics at some they didn't say Dink Squat University, but they put, his university kind of in quotes. And he said, well, there's this guy who thinks that we can, fly into space on the back of rockets. And obviously he doesn't understand even the physics that we teach at high school every day to our students. You can't have a rocket propulsion in space. Newton's laws of action and reaction tell you that'll never work. And that was in the New York Times, and he was kind of widely written off. And for decades, he was ignored. It turns out that, in fact, ignoring Loonshots can be very dangerous. Although he's ignored in the U.S., he wasn't ignored during the Second World War in Germany. And so Nazi scientists read his papers and developed the first jet engines to power jet planes. The first jet planes was a German Messerschmitt plane. And those planes flew 120 miles an hour faster than any Allied plane. They developed the first missiles. Those missiles, the buzz bombs, caused havoc in London. Fortunately, during the Second World War, they came too late to turn the course of the war. But that's an example. Kennedy's declaration was a moonshot. Goddard's idea was a classic loonshot. A moonshot is a destination. Nurturing loonshots is how we get there. And the reason most teams and companies and people miss loonshots is that one of the reasons is the false fail. So a false fail is when you get a negative result that's due not to the inherent properties of the loonshot, that it's a bad idea, but some kind of flaw in the experiment. So in the example I mentioned with Facebook, people were seeing users leave all the time from social networks. And they said, well, social networks suck. That this idea of a loonshot of a social network, of connecting people online, is a bad idea. Well, it was a false fail because it was a flaw in the experiment. People were leaving some of these social networks because they weren't designed, they weren't built well. The software wasn't good at the time. Not that the underlying idea was flawed. So a false fail is when the test is flawed rather than the idea.
When you start to think, and I'm going to take you back to the beginning in a second here and kind of really open it up about group behavior and some of your influences that got you started on your newest work here, Loonshots. But I was thinking about the notion of Loonshots and just trying to look at my life and experiences I've had, and music came to my mind really quick. And I started to think about the artists out there that took Loonshots in music, for example. When it would have been the only thing you were supposed to do was a 3-minute song and boom, boom, boom. And then, Queen in the 1970s does Bohemian Rhapsody. Leonard Skinner does Freebird. These things go on for 7-8 minutes or whatever. That's one way to start to think about the notion of a loonshot, is you really taking that chance is where the breakthrough happens. It's pretty easy to see when you go through your work. You can see so many people and systems and organizations that put the wall up to the loonshots. But my gosh, the loonshot is where the money, the fame, the recognition, everything comes from that. It's what we all want.
That's why it comes back to asking good questions, because when people are blowing an idea off, whether it's a social network or a certain type of music, if you keep a kind of a questioning mindset, like, why are people blowing this off? What's really going on here? You may find the twist that gives you the answer of what everyone is missing. And when you find what everyone is missing, and when you've really dug deep, that's when you have a billion-dollar idea.
And you've kind of taken this mindset and applied it just across the spectrum to, I think you do a hell of a job of causing us all to think even more. But listen, this starts with, you seem to have this passion for group behavior, to look at groups. Why don't you kind of get into how you started to unfold Loonshots? I mean, there were some early experiences. I know there's one experience you lead the book off with, a hospital experience, which I really found fascinating.
Part of it I started thinking about when I was, as I think you mentioned at the beginning, I started in academic science and theoretical physics, and then I transitioned into the business world and eventually ended up kind of bridging the two worlds between science and business and running a biotech company. And so for the first few years of running a biotech company, when we were a tiny startup, we started from 2 people, then we grew to, we were about 50 people, 60 people. I was, for the first time, on the side of biomedical research. I wasn't a patient. I was on the other side of the table. I was trying to develop new drugs, and we had a team that was really passionate and excited about developing new drugs for cancer. And about 4 years into it, my father came down with a rare form of leukemia. At the time, I'd been in the research side. I'd been working with cancer docs at all sorts of top hospitals, and we had been developing our own cancer drugs. And so now I'm an insider in this field. So now I go with my dad to different hospitals and talk about the treatments that are available. But I feel like I'm, an insider. These are people that I talk to. These are researchers that I talk to in the course of running with my team, doing what we're doing and trying to develop new drugs. But I'm sitting on the other side of the table as a patient or a relative of a patient. And it was kind of mind-boggling. I would sit with physicians and they would say, well, I'm very sorry, but there's just no new drugs. There's nothing. And there was one guy who was in his 70s who was a very nice physician, and he just said, it just makes me very sad, but I'm still treating patients today with the same drugs that I used when I was in my 20s, 50 years ago. And I just couldn't believe it. I just couldn't, how has it been 50 years and the war on cancer and these billions of dollars in research and we don't have any new drugs for, for leukemia, for some of the most prevalent cancers. It just seemed to be a disconnect with, on the one hand, I'm talking to scientists all the time and there's just dozens of ideas and dozens of promising things. On the other hand, the reality, when you're on the other side of the table, is there's nothing out there. So what's this funnel? A lot of people think, well, we just don't have enough ideas. And when you're really in the middle of it, that's really not the problem. There are tons of ideas out there. There are tons of papers published with new biology. There are tons of early stage drug candidates out there. The problem is not in the supply of the ideas. The problem is getting those ideas and translating them into products. You'd think, well, it's, just a money issue. And that's true. You do need investment dollars. You do need investors putting in money and making sure there's enough return to attract that investor dollars. But there was something else. Because the more I worked either with small companies or large companies, and before that, I'd been at a large consulting firm. So I'd worked with Fortune 50 companies for several years, and I'd been inside and when I was at a small company, collaborating with these. So I'd been kind of in all these different environments. And it was clear that everybody individually wanted new drugs. There's this sort of, when you haven't been an insider, when you haven't worked in the field, you think, well, there's these pharma companies that are full of, people might think, oh, they're full of these evil people who just want to suppress ideas. That's just not how it works. The people inside the big companies and the small companies are the same as you and me. They all have relatives who get diseases, or they get diseases themselves. They all want to work on promising ideas that can make a big difference. Whether you're at a big company or a small company, you want to go home and tell your spouse or your kids or your friends, I made a huge difference. I worked on a drug that saved people's lives. It doesn't matter where you are. Everybody individually is like that. Yet something happens when you bring people together. The same person who's just as excited about wanting the next great new thing when he's at a small company will be pounding the table for the crazy idea and working day and night to save it when it stumbles. But you put him inside the big company and all of a sudden the tie goes on and the suit goes on, and then you have to write a PhD thesis about all the pros and the cons, and everything takes, years. So what happens? Why does the same person suddenly change behavior? And you take that same person right back out of the big company. And when I was at a small company, we would hire people from the big company, and you take them, you put them inside your company, and boom, the suit goes off, the tie goes off, and they're pounding the table, about the next crazy idea. You move them back to a big company, tie goes back on, suit goes back on, they become but it's not something inherent to the person. And it reminded me of something that you see from my previous life, from working in science, which is, if you think about a glass of water, water will go through these phase changes. So if you take a glass of water for, room temperature, you stick your finger in, you can swirl it around. It's liquid, it sloshes around. But when you change the temperature, all of a sudden, boom, something changes. And the molecules become completely rigid. You can't stick your finger. The behavior totally changes. But it's exactly the same molecules inside. So why? How do those molecules know to suddenly change? There isn't some lead molecule saying, all right, you're going to be liquid today, you're going to be solid tomorrow. It has nothing to do with that. It's something about the temperature. It's something about the interaction between those molecules that makes them change behavior. It reminded me enormously of this person working in a big company, person working in a small company. It's not about that person or individually. Is he risk averse? Is he not risk averse? It's something about the environment. If I take a drop of water and I drop it onto a block of ice, what'll happen? It'll freeze. If I take the same drop of water and I drop it into a glass of water, what'll happen? It'll slosh around with all the other water molecules. That drop of water or an individual molecule, it's not about, is it that molecule inherently rigid, or is it inherently flexible? It's something about the environment. So that just got me very curious about what is it? And maybe we can think differently. Is there a different way to think of it? So it's coming back to what we started with, which is just asking why. Why is it that if I take one water molecule and drop it on a block of ice, it'll freeze, and if I drop it into a glass of water, it'll slosh around with all the other molecules? And is there something similar in the behavior of groups? And the more I worked on that, the more I saw, yeah, there is a different way to think about how people behave, which is kind of a very different way to think about innovation and the behavior of teams and the behavior of companies, and turns out to have some really surprising, fun, interesting answers. So the answer is yes, there are these what's called in science or physics emergent behaviors. And you can think of a group or a team or a company innovating well as an emergent behavior, a property of the collective interactions of those molecules, of the people and the teams and companies. All the literature of like the CEO has to do this or the CEO has to do that, just get rid of that. It's, in fact, steering you in exactly the wrong direction. You want to think about what is the equivalent of temperature? What are those parameters that you adjust inside group that can shift a group from being incredibly flexible and embracing wild new ideas to all of a sudden becoming completely rigid and inflexible? What are the equivalent of temperature? What are the equivalent parameters of temperature? And of course, I'm talking about temperature just to keep it simple with a glass of water, but matter has more than one control parameter. So temperature is one thing that will change a collection of molecules from sloshing around and liquid to rigid and solid, but so is pressure. For example, if I put salt in water, I completely change the ability. That's why we throw salt on our driveways after a snowfall. We lower the freezing point. So the density of salt in water is another parameter that affects that transition. So there are several parameters, and that's what I ended up working out and showing, that this kind of different way of thinking about the behaviors of teams and companies and groups, if you work that out, you find that there are these sort of 4 control parameters in how you design organizations that control this transition between embracing wild new ideas and rigidly rejecting them. And that just gives you a different way of thinking about the behavior of groups.
Pulling out of context a little bit here, but kind of going where you're saying right now, I like the idea, the way you set it forward, separating the artist and the soldiers. It doesn't necessarily mean the soldier is better than the artist, nor is the artist better than the soldier. But we at least have to acknowledge the difference between the two, and they're very, very different.
So I've been kind of nucleating these ideas for a while, and about 6 or 7 years ago, I got a call on if I would join President Obama's Council of Science Advisors on a project to think about the future of national research. How should the U.S., what should we recommend to the President of the United States about how the national research infrastructure should be changed to continue the next wave of innovation, the next 50 years of innovation? And the first day, the chairman of that group told us, there was 5 of us working on this project, and the chairman stood up and said, your job is to write the next generation of the Vannevar Bush report. And unfortunately, I had no idea who Vannevar Bush was or what his report said. So I had to do some fast digging because, at the time I was still running a small biotech company, and I really didn't have any experience in politics or science policy. But that got me started on this artists and soldiers. So Vannevar Bush, as it turns out, was the guy who probably more than any other single person, made a difference in turning the course of World War II. And when you mention artists and soldiers, that's in many ways, that was his realization. And that's where I kind of got the idea. It wasn't exactly his language, but it's sort of hard to appreciate this now with all the sort of World War II movies and in hindsight, where the Allied victory sort of seems kind of obvious in hindsight. But if you try to imagine going back to the beginning of the war, to early, before the U.S. got involved, in fact, before it broke out in Europe, you think just back to early 1939, the odds didn't look good for the Allies. The Germans had these advanced submarines that looked ready to strangle the Atlantic, and they did. They were shooting down more ships than the Allies could build every month. They had these new kinds of planes that made the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, essentially invisible, and they were. They kind of bombed Western Europe into submission within weeks.
Britain was sitting there going, uh-oh, we're next.
We're next. And in fact, they came just within a millimeter of wiping out Britain, too. And then in early 1939, there was these two German scientists who discovered something called nuclear fission, splitting the atom, which released nuclear energy. And that put Hitler within reach of essentially the most destructive weapon ever created by mankind. So if you were a betting person, you would have been right to bet on Nazi Germany. The lead that they had in technology, and technology that can make a big difference for the outcome of the war, was looked at the time to be insurmountable. And Vannevar Bush was a guy who at the time was dean of engineering at MIT, and he was an incredible inventor. He'd invented the first analog computer. He was an incredible entrepreneur. He understood how to work with businesses. He started a company which now is called Raytheon. But he'd also worked with the military, and he understood all three of these, very different types of organizations: academia, businesses, the military. He'd worked with the military in World War I as a young guy, in fact, hunting submarines. And he knew that the military, and he was still consulting with the Navy, and he knew that the Navy had no answer for the submarine problem. No answer, despite it having been 3 decades since the First World War. And he knew enough about the military to know that they just weren't investing in closing this gap. So he quit his job. He'd turned MIT from an average university into the leading engineering school in the country and eventually the world. So he quit his job, and he was enormously respected as organizational, in many ways, kind of an organizational genius. And the president of MIT said, well, listen, don't quit your job. We need you here. If you stay, I will resign and make you president. And he said, no, look, the country is at risk, and it's my duty to serve it. So he quit his job at MIT, moved to Washington, and talked his way into meeting with the president, President Franklin Roosevelt. And it was a 10-minute meeting, and he told him, there's a war coming, and we're going to lose. The Nazis are far ahead of us in the technology that's going to make a difference for this war, and the military will never catch up in time. And he handed FDR a single sheet of paper with 3 small paragraphs in the middle with a proposal, and FDR read it and looked it over, signed it, okay, FDR, gave it back to him. And that single 10-minute meeting probably turned the course of the war more than any other meeting during the war, and it helped set the stage for the U.S. to lead the world in science and technology ever since. And what Bush did, and what he asked FDR, is he said, listen, I want you to authorize me to create a group of scientists who are going to work on these crazy new technologies, the Loonshots that we need, completely outside of the military. I'll report to no one other than you. And FDR agreed. And what happened over the next several years is that Bush did, in fact, do that. And the technologies that came out of his group ended up not only catching up to the German lead, but eventually surpassing them. And the tools and the technologies that he developed ended up turning the course of many critical battles over the Second World War. And so what did he do? He didn't try to change culture. Like all this stuff you read about, oh, let's try to create an innovative culture. He said, no, forget it. He said, the military has its its tight discipline and its execution for a reason. We need to deploy millions of soldiers across 4 continents. We need to distribute supplies and logistics to these millions of soldiers. We need to build, tons and tons of guns and ships and planes. And for that, you need exactly the kind of culture that the military has. That same culture, however, is not conducive to nurturing loonshots. And that comes back to the glass of water. The military is that solid, rigid, high operational excellence culture that you need. But you also need that fluid, crazy, sloshing around stuff to create these innovative new weapons. And that's the problem. Water can't be both solid and liquid at the same time. That's the problem with a lot of these sort of books on culture. They say, oh, we want operational excellence, and oh, we want innovation, and you should all be both at the exact same time. That's like trying to have your glass of water be both liquid and solid at the same time. That doesn't make sense. There's one exception to that rule, and that's what Bush did. He understood that, yes, we can't be both solid and liquid at the same time. We can't have this incredible tight execution and discipline, but also nurture crazy ideas at the same time. Yes, we get that. And in science, there's one exception to that rule, that you can't be both liquid and solid at the same time. And that's right at the edge of a phase transition. So right at 32 Fahrenheit, water can be both solid and liquid at the same time, because you're right on the cusp. Water molecules can be either liquid or they can be solid. But here's the thing. They're not all at both solid and liquid at exactly the same time. What happens is they separate. So if you bring a bathtub to 32 Fahrenheit, what you will see is there will be blocks of ice that will form, and there will be pools of liquid that will form, and they separate. The molecules go back and forth. So a molecule in a pool of liquid will swim by a block, and it'll reach the surface, and it will lock on and freeze. Or, on the other side of the block, some molecules might be near the surface, and they'll start jiggling, and they'll peel off and start swimming around in the pool. And they'll go back and forth in this dynamic cycle between liquid and solid and liquid and solid. So right at the edge of a phase transition, you get what's called separation, phase separation. You separate the liquid and the solid. There's continuous exchange, but you separate the two. And that's what Bush did. He separated his artists working on crazy new ideas from the soldiers working on operational excellence. And he saw his job not as pushing any one particular idea or one particular project. He saw his job as maintaining life at 32 Fahrenheit, maintaining the balance between the solid and the liquid, between the artists and the soldiers. So to answer your question, that's where the idea came from, that you need to separate your artists and soldiers, and you create different structures for the artists and different structures for the soldiers. You have different compensation systems, different incentive systems, different processes, because you have different objectives. So when you read about, just have this kind of one innovative culture thing that you apply everywhere, it doesn't make any sense. If you want innovative cultures, you need high failure rates. Because innovation comes from trying a lot of stuff and having a lot of stuff fail until you find the thing that works. On the other hand, if you want extremely high operational excellence, if you want to distribute stuff with you want very low failure rates. So you can't have high failure rates and low failure rates at the same time. It doesn't make sense. Right? So what I mean by low failure, if you're building, for example, if you're building planes, you don't want to launch 10 planes in the sky and see which 8 crash. So building planes belongs in the soldier group. You want high operational excellence. You want low failure rates. On the other hand, if you're designing wacky new technologies for those planes, you want a small group working on the crazy ideas that could become new technologies. So you want to separate your artists working on the completely crazy stuff with high failure rates and an environment that encourages that from the soldiers that are working towards very strong and important high quality metrics, low error rate metrics. So that's what I mean by separating artists and soldiers.
I want to add something in the book, let people go read too, but the specific work that was done with radar at the time, just fascinating to see how that changed the air war coming to Britain that never got there, and then figuring out the sub issue so it could open the lane to get the Allies to then free Western Germany. Western Europe. Fascinating. Just really cool stuff. And I think the other issue that's really cool there too is the speed at which it was done. That once they kind of knew, and you go into detail about this, but the speed was absolutely amazing. I mean, we're talking like literally months. They got all of this stuff going so quickly.
That's what turned me on is that Bush, at the time, he was widely hailed and recognized throughout Congress and Washington as a person who really helped turn the course of the war for creating this system and nurturing these innovation and nurturing these technologies. Incredibly widely respected in the military and all levels of government. But today, not many people know who he is outside of kind of a small core of engineering diehards. Or I happen to live not far from MIT, and at MIT, of course, he's a big hero. But he invented this system for innovating astonishingly fast. And that system not only made the difference in that war, but especially because he was so widely regarded in Washington at the time and credited with these innovations that turned the course of the war, his system helped establish what is now the national research system of the United States. So his system eventually turned into the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, on the military side, DARPA, and the many sort of versions of DARPA that exist across the military. And the national research infrastructure of the United States, all those research agencies that kind of grew out of Bush's ideas about how to organize scientists and people working on new technologies for rapid innovation, gave us GPS, the internet, the biotechnology industry, dozens and dozens of important cures for major diseases, and essentially so many of the innovations that have helped the United States lead the world in science and technology for the 50 years after the war, for the second half of the 20th century, and hopefully more beyond that. So Bush's ideas, they were the seed or the foundation that helped inspire this system, but they've been kind of lost to history for various reasons. So when I got on this project a bunch of years ago and I started teasing out what it was that he did and why he did it, and then putting it together with kind of more modern ideas about asking why Bush had an intuitive understanding of why these groups behave differently and that you shouldn't try to change them. You shouldn't try to change military culture. It's good and you should keep it for a reason. When I combined, what he did with sort of more modern scientific ways of thinking about the behaviors of groups, I got this kind of interesting way of thinking about how to design organizations to be more innovative. And a lot of it came back to, as you said, thinking about what we did during the Second World War.
But it's not just necessarily, of course, something that's USA-centric. This goes back over the millennia. This goes back in time. There's a reason, for example, and I think we could probably say, at least going through your work, we could probably say this is because at some point in time, Chinese leaders moved away from Loonshots and went to, other ways of doing things. So there's probably a very straightforward reason that you and I are not having this conversation right now in Chinese.
Yeah, that's right. And, the immediate kind of nucleating event for writing this project was when I was recruited for Obama's Council of Science Advisors and started digging into this rapid innovation system that Vannevar Bush developed. But a few years earlier, I had asked a very kind of a strange question, which is exactly what you asked. Why do we all speak English? Why is the standard language of business around the world English? And that came because I was giving these talks about kind of history of science and history of physics and over a couple thousand years. And I kept getting stuck with this first question, which is, why did modern science really take off in Western Europe around 17th century, plus or minus a few years, which is what really, it drove the steam engine, it drove industrial power, it allowed these tiny little countries in Western Europe to overpower these much bigger empires of China, India, or Islamic Empire. It was kind of the ultimate reason why we ended up speaking, one of these Western European languages rather than Chinese or Hindi or Arabic. I just kept getting stuck with this question of, when you look at the history, China and India dominated world history, not just for a few years, but for 1,000 years. The U.S. is formed in 1776. So the entire period of U.S. history is a small fraction of the period of world history that China and India dominated the world. It's a very small and in fact, the U.S. has dominated the world economy. If you maybe in the last 100 years, that's 1/10 of the period that China and India dominated the world. So China and India had about 50% of the world GDP from the middle of the first millennium, around 500, to the middle of the second millennium, to around the 1500s, the 16th century or so. They dominated all the early technologies. They dominated the early science. So at various peaks from the 9th to the 13th century, Islamic science was by far the most advanced in the world. Islamic astronomy, Islamic experiments, the observatories they set up, the libraries they set up, the scholarly pursuits. There was just no comparison. And Western Europe was a complete backwater compared to what was going on in the different observatories in Islam. In India, much of the mathematics that we use today was transmitted into Western Europe by some of the Arabic libraries and centers and scholars during that period came straight from India. Many of the technologies that helped Western Europe grow in the second part of the millennium came from China. All the irrigation systems, the compass, the gunpowder, even currency, paper and printing was developed in China for about 1,000 years before it was developed in Western Europe.
1,000 years is a significant period of time.
Right. We're not talking about the invention of the telephone. One guy did it one day and the other guy did it the next day. They had paper and printing and they had currency for 1,000 years. We pride ourselves on universities. Well, the Chinese had a imperial civil service system with incredibly rigorous testing, at the standards of a Harvard or a Stanford today, only 1 or 2% achieving the elite levels, an incredibly educated population before Western Europe ever opened its first door on its first university. And they had that for 700 years before the first door. When you look at those facts, you kind of ask yourself, well, why is the standard language of business English? Why does everybody speak English? Why doesn't everybody speak Hindi or Arabic? Or if these empires dominated for so long, what happened? And I just kept getting stuck on that question. And, it wasn't like it's the same thing we were just talking about, the large companies, the big pharma. It's not like big pharma doesn't innovate well because everybody sits around a desk and saying, how do I crush innovation? How do I be a not innovative person? That's not what happens in there. There's something about the behavior of groups. And if you look at the Chinese leaders, many of the Chinese leaders were incredibly innovative. And it finally kind of dawned on me that I was asking the same question. In the biotech world, so if you ask why does the innovations in the biotech or drug discovery seem to come from this teeming mass of tiny little hundreds of tiny little kind of impoverished biotech companies seem to come up with all the crazy innovations, and the Merck, Pfizer, and Novartis, it's sort of keep doing the same kind of thing. Well, it kind of dawned on me that China, Islam, and India were the Merck, Pfizer, and Novartis of their day. They were the giant global empires. And the hundreds of tiny, impoverished little countries in Western Europe, which were kind of the backwaters of the time, was the teeming market of biotechs. And so the birth of modern science and the birth of modern weaponry and the birth of industrialization happened in this teeming market in Western Europe, just like the birth of new drugs happens mostly in the teeming market of hundreds of impoverished biotech companies. So it was that idea, and it was nothing about the individuals. It wasn't, all this stuff that, well, Chinese culture was this, or Chinese geography was that, or Indian culture was this, or Islamic culture was this. These arguments that the modern science and the modern ideas couldn't take shape in Islam because of the culture is just crap, because these cultures were so different. The cultures in Europe were so different. You can't make one generalization about culture, or even geography. The geography in China is enormously varied. The geography in the Islamic Empire was enormously varied, and geography in India is enormously varied. And if geography or culture was the answer of why these innovations happened in Western Europe, well, how can you explain the fact that China and India led the world in innovation and in organization and in new ideas for 1,000 years? The height of their mountains didn't suddenly change. The direction of their rivers didn't suddenly change. Their cultures didn't suddenly change.
Structure changed.
It was the structure. So you had a market in Western Europe, whereas China and India and Islam were the Merck, Pfizer, and Novartis. They were these large groups of people. So even, and as I do mention, I think the story you referred to in the book, there were all these early ideas of science and experiments and astronomy in China, but they got crushed by the weight of the empire. Just like in Merck, Pfizer, and Novartis, there are all these early ideas of new drugs, and they'll get crushed. So that's why in Western Europe, we had hundreds of these tiny little competing empires, tiny little, these kingdoms or city-states or rulers, each of which could support different crazy ideas. If one ruler happened to withdraw funding, as did happen in the case of, for example, Tycho Brahe, one ruler happened to withdraw funding and said, all right, Tycho Brahe at the time, as an example, had this island where he was doing this great astronomy, and he brought Kepler, and that was a very important part of the scientific revolution in Western Europe. Well, the Danish king decided one day that he didn't like Tycho anymore, and he completely withdrew his funding. And so he had nowhere to go. Well, in the case when that same sort of thing happened in China, and there was a great astronomer 5 centuries before Tycho, and the emperor said, well, I don't like you anymore, you're done, I'm withdrawing your funding. And in the case in China, the emperor arrested the guy, and he lived under house arrest for most of his life. In the case of Tycho, the Danish king withdrew his funding, said, I don't like you anymore, stop all that science stuff. And he said, okay, he packed up his stuff and wandered around Europe for a year or two until he found some other guy who could fund him. That's very similar to what happens in biotech or any market of small companies. You have a venture capitalist, and one day they decide they don't really like your project anymore. They don't like to see, and they withdraw funding, and your company's done. Well, the company's done and the funding's done, but the idea is not done. And that's what usually happens in biotech. If a venture capitalist withdraw funding, well, then the team that was working on that project can walk around and look for different investors, and eventually it gets funded. In the case of drug discovery, that's where most of the breakthroughs came from. They very often they were at lots of small companies that failed. So, for example, we're switching between different fields here, but
that's the whole point of the book, is to actually break this down to something where the fields are not so unique. I mean, they're unique, but it's what's going on, the process here.
We're making an analogy between the scientific revolution and why it happened in Western Europe with what happens in drug discovery. So I'll give you an example you read about in the papers all the time, which is cancer immunotherapy. It's a new kind of class of drugs, which is drugs that activate the body's immune system to fight tumors. And if you read the papers, it sounds like it just appeared overnight, a few years ago. But if you're on the research side, if you're an insider, you know that idea was floating around for decades. In fact, it actually began about 100 years ago. And what happened was it was just the idea of fighting the body's immune system would be at this one little small company, and they'd run these large trials, and the trials would fail. And then the investors would withdraw money, the company would disappear. But the idea with some twist would, hop along to the next company and the next investors. And that process repeated for decades because the initial ideas for how to do that didn't quite work. And then you would try another twist, and that didn't quite work. And then you try another twist, and that didn't quite work. And each of these were at mostly at small companies that failed. And then eventually, somewhat surprisingly, since everybody had given up on it, one of these small companies had a particular twist, and it worked. That's why the Loonshots, because there's so many, as we talked about, false fails, and there's so many reasons new ideas stumble. They're never as good as they seem in hindsight. You need a market that will keep supporting these crazy ideas. And Western Europe at the time was the market that kept supporting crazy ideas, just like the biotech market is the market that keeps supporting these crazy ideas, most of which will fail, but a small fraction of which will become very important therapies that can save lives. And that's why we need both. We need, just like we talked about inside groups or companies, we want to separate the artists from soldiers. What we're now talking about is at the level of industries. You have all the market where you separate the innovations or the crazy new ideas. That's the biotech market. And then the soldiers, the Merck, Pfizer, and Novartis. You really do need the large companies that have the global reach to commercialize and distribute and manufacture. You need both. You need the artists and the soldiers. It isn't that one is better and one is worse. To have a functioning industry, you need both. Just like to have a functioning company, you need both innovation and operational excellence. And you achieve that by separating the two.
To add a little bit more to the discussion of Britain back in the day and in India and China. And, I guess Britain shows up at China's doorstep with steam-powered warships, and this much larger country, China, with basically wooden junks, they didn't stand a chance. But what's interesting about that, and of course that starts to, and I want to jump to the scientific method in a second, as you describe perhaps the mother of all loon shots. But what I love about the story with Britain and China and India is that you start to think, well, let's bring it up to today. Okay, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, that was absolutely the loon shot. Britain showing up with steam-powered warships. They take control of these vast populations. But it's now changed today. And I sometimes think about a country like China. They've probably set down multiple loon shots in the last 50 years with the primary intent of saying, we will never let that happen to us again. We will never let a small country do to China what happened to us. So it's interesting. It's not a static process. It's always changing. A new loon shot can happen and can completely change the landscape. So it's just never static.
You work in trading. I spent a lot of time with hedge funds, and I worked on a trading floor. And as you know, in markets, arbitrage opportunities disappear very quickly. Inefficiencies, or, if you discover a new trading algorithm, there are lots of other hedge funds that are working, and pretty soon that trading algorithm doesn't end up making you as much money after a while. You've exploited it, and then other people start exploiting it, and then it kind of goes away. And that's, I think for the last 50 or 70 years of American history, Vannevar Bush helped invent this new system for innovating enormously fast, and his success and the success in the Second World War proved that out. And so Congress got behind creating this national research infrastructure, which helped drive the U.S. economy and the lead in science and technology for 70 years. But as you say, people have figured that out now. And that's not unique. People can create, other countries can create the similar kinds of system. And China is obviously doing that. Taiwan is doing a very good job in that. Japan has been trying to do that. And many of the Western European nations are trying to do that as well, and some with some very good success. It really does become a question like in the markets. Now, once you've found an opportunity, lots of people will step in to try to exploit that, and you need to stay a step ahead.
Where's the next fat tail?
Exactly. You need to stay ahead of the competition by figuring out what can we do now, given that everybody has sort of figured out that this is a key to success. What else can we be doing to, if you're American, to preserve the lead in world science and technology innovation for the next 70 years, just like we have had for the previous 70 years. And if you're a competitor to America, if you're China or Japan or Russia, what can we do to outcompete? How can we imitate what has helped America over the previous 70 years? And then what can we do better so we can outcompete? If you're sitting in the federal government, you're thinking, well, today is a very different story. But what you should be thinking about is, well, what worked for the last 70 years may not work for the next 70 years. So what else should we be doing today to preserve American economic lead and the lead in military technologies, which is important for national security?
It sure seems like when you lay down the gauntlet of getting people to understand that a good structure separates the artists and the soldiers. In my mind, while that looks great on paper and I can go through your work and I'm just like having a light bulb moment every page, and you're just like, wow, okay, very, very, very kind of just makes you stop, pause, and go, that is a better way to look at things, right? But the human ego is tough, I mean, the artists don't necessarily want to share. The soldiers don't necessarily think the artists are worth that much. I'm pondering the Alan Turing movie that came out a while back, and I remember some of those scenes where it should have just been, let the guy just go do what he does. Let him go create his magic, develop the computing system, the code breaking system. But, it's kind of like he also had to juggle dealing inside the military and with that structure. And it's been gnawing at me as going through your work is the Alan Turing example as well, too, where it seemed like he was somebody that was who should have just been completely left to his own devices. Let him go invent. Let him do what he does best. And ultimately, he did do a lot of fine work. I just love this idea. And you look, Apple Computer is probably the greatest modern example that we can all think of, because Steve Jobs knew about this artists and soldiers. He knew deep down about it, didn't he?
No, the examples you mentioned are great examples. The bottom line is that once you take a look at history and take a look at the lessons from history and the lessons about the companies that have actually succeeded versus the companies that looked good for a while and then eventually failed, the main takeaway from that is if you're a leader, you need to change your mindset on what it means to lead. So there's this kind of myth that a great leader has these brilliant ideas and beats everybody to like back, these great ideas created that come out of his genius mind. And, there's this mythos around Steve Jobs, and that's absolutely not what happened. It wasn't these ideas coming out of Jobs' mind and he beat everybody into submission to take these ideas. And in fact, when he did do that, it was a total disaster. In the first version of Apple, when he was first at Apple, his first time around, he did have that mindset of like, I'm the genius, I'm stand on top of a mountain and I anoint the next crazy idea, that the holy Loonshot, and everybody should just do what I say. And it was a complete disaster. He drove the company almost into bankruptcy, and the products that he ended up championing nearly failed. The Macintosh when it first came out, was kind of a disaster, and he was forced out because he was creating unsustainable havoc for the company. And when he came back the second time, he had learned a lot of these Vannevar Bush lessons, and he had a very different mindset, one that's kind of not appreciated very well in this sort of very short summaries. He understood that the job of the leader isn't to come up with the new ideas. The job of the leader is to maintain the touch and the balance between the artist and the soldiers. Because in innovation, the failure point is not in the supply of new ideas, is not in the number of Alan Turings. As I mentioned earlier, we talked about earlier, there are tons of new ideas. There are tons of promising new ideas coming out of, the creative artist or the creative scientist or creative engineers. There are tons of new ideas. There will always be tension between the soldiers that are needed to implement those ideas and the artists who are coming up with those ideas, because they're speaking different languages. They have different value systems, different ways of talking, different things that are important to them. Artists will often say, well, here's my idea. All you guys should just love it because it's such a beautiful idea. Look at my baby. It's just, isn't it awesome? Right? And that's very often the case. And they're, like, well, why aren't you sitting down with these guys and walking them through how it works and, and explaining to them and then listening when they, they say, well, I don't think this is really going to be what customers want, or I don't think this is really going to quite. The artists are like, it's a beautiful idea. That's not my job. And then the soldiers over there are like, they receive this kind of early stage idea and they're like, well, interesting. I like cool new stuff, but it's just totally impractical. It's going to flop. And they're right, too. The language for communicating between the two is not there because they're from different worlds. And that's where most innovation fails. It's the link between the artists and the soldiers. And so the next generation or the next way of thinking, the mindset that you need today, is that your job isn't to pick the right idea if you're a leader. Your job is to manage that weak link. So this is what Vannevar Bush did in World War II. So I'll give you one example. We talked about radar. So there was this group of creative artists, these scientists, sequestered in an anonymous building at MIT called the RAD Lab, the Radiation Lab. And they were working on it, and they came up with this phenomenal device, microwave radar. And so submarines have been sinking, the U-boats, the German submarines have been sinking Allied ships month after month for 3.5 years. And England, as we talked about, it was a very dangerous situation. Both Churchill and FDR recognized that that was the crucial battle of the war. England had reached just 3 months of oil left. By the spring of 1943, they were starving. And a few more months of the U-boat strangling the Atlantic, and that would have been the end of it. There would have been no England. There would have been no oil for, British guns and ships. And these scientists at the RAD Lab at MIT came up with microwave radar. And when you put microwave radar on these long-range bombers and flew them over the Atlantic, all of a sudden you could see these dark U-boats lit up their screens, and it became like shooting fish in a barrel. And in weeks they wiped out the U-boat menace. But what happened when they first came up with radar? Well, the scientists at the Rad Lab were like, yay, we figured it out. We got this technology. We test. We go on at the top of a building in Boston, and we point to the Boston Harbor and see there's this test submarine. It lights up our machines. We're done. We figured it out. This is awesome. Okay, you military guys, you guys go ahead and take it. So what happened? Nothing. For a year and a half, nothing happened. And the scientists are kind of going crazy, like, what the hell? I mean, we've invented this technology. It's incredibly important. Why aren't these pilots using it? This is nuts. So that's when Vannevar Bush stepped in. He got the scientists to get on a plane and sit in the cockpit with these pilots. And when they got on the plane, they could see that the pilots, in the middle of battle, when they're being shot at and they have to figure out left, right, and look around them in the planes, they didn't have time to fiddle with the dozens of switches on this black box technology that the scientists had invented at MIT. They were busy trying to avoid being shot down. So the scientists immediately realized that it wasn't the technology that was a problem. Their user interface sucked. So they went back to the lab and very quickly invented a graphical way of seeing the same thing. If you look in the movies and you see this sort of sweeping line and dots, that's called a PPI display. So they invented that. They gave that to the pilots, and all of a sudden, boom, they started using radar. But the key was that Vannevar Bush intervened, and not just in one direction, not just in holding a gun to a soldier's head and saying, use this new technology, but holding a gun to the scientist's head, to the artist, and saying, go sit next to the soldier and find out why he's not using your beautiful invention. And then you'll learn something. So it's enforcing, if you're a leader, your job is not to pick the great new technology. Your job, it's like a parent with, different kids. Your job is to get them to play together well. Your job is to manage that weak link. And so when Steve Jobs went back to Apple, he wasn't the same Steve Jobs he was in his, 20s and at the first version of Apple, where he was saying, and actually he used the word artist. He said, all these people working on my new Macintosh product are the artists, and everybody else who's working on the franchise at the time, it was the Apple III franchise. You guys are the regular Navy, the soldiers. And, he called them, bozos. And so he created enormous hostility between the artists and the soldiers. And that was a disaster. All these good people on both sides just started leaving the company. That really hurt the company. When he came back 12 years later, he had learned the much more mature mindset of your job is to balance the artists and the soldiers. So he created a group under Joni Eve, which was developing all these wonderful new designs and wonderful new technologies. And he brought in Tim Cook, who was actually, when he was before, I think it was at Compaq, he was called the Attila the Hun of inventory. He was like the ultimate soldier. And he had both Joni Eve and he had, the Attila the Hun of inventory. He had his artists and his soldiers, and his job was to balance the two. I remember there was this great quote at the end of one of his biographies. There were these two 900-page biographies that came out a couple of years ago. And the end of them, I think it was a Walter Isaacson one, when he was towards the end of his life, he told Isaacson, he said, I think my greatest innovation was the organization. Not any one product or any one idea. He said, it was the organization that I built. And if you think back, what he did was he managed by balancing his artists and his soldiers. He managed the touch and balance between those two.
There's an interesting aspect to thinking about the MIT scientist and Steve Jobs' second version of Apple, is that in both situations, there was kind of at least from my perspective, a waiting till things had got to an extreme edge, an extreme point of like, it's going to all just blow up. Look, the second version of Apple, Bill Gates essentially funded Apple and gave Steve Jobs a lifeline, to then do all the innovation that started back with the iPod and the first iMacs. And, if you think about it, like also we had to get to the point to where Britain and the States had to imagine being under Hitler rule, like it's going to happen before, in the case of Jobs and the case of America and Britain, before the Loonshots were launched.
Right. So Jobs was brought in the second time at Apple to rescue a franchising crisis. So Apple was flailing. So they were far behind. They had developed an early lead with Apple 1 or 2 in the early 80s, and then they were rapidly surpassed by IBM, among others, and Commodore even before that, and Radio Shack. And so Apple had become a distant minor player in the PC market.
In the early 90s, it was pretty much dead.
It was dead, and everybody had written them off. And they tried they tried to sell the company, I don't know, half dozen times. There were various CEOs after Scully left, and each of them tried to sell the company, and no one would buy it. So before pulling the plugs, they hired back Jobs, who at the time had been running, for the previous 10 years, had been running Next, which was what he started after he left Apple the first time. And that had not gone very well. And then a small film production company called Pixar that he'd bought on sort of a whim because they had this cool, shiny new computer called the Pic.
That one kind of did well.
It did well, but not for the reason that he bought the company. He bought the company because he thought the graphics hardware would make a really great new machine that he could compete with Apple with his, and it turned out that a couple people on the side were working on this animation thing that, he tried to quash a few times, but then Toy Story came out, and who knew? All of a sudden, he was like the world's biggest champion of animation, and that made him a success. And so, yeah, Apple brought him in the second time, and it was a Hail Mary play, and it was actually described as a Hail Mary play among computer analysts because he was not well regarded, because the first version of Apple, had not done well when he was there, and then he started this Next hardware company, and that had not done well, and so to bring him in to a computer at the time as a computer hardware company didn't seem like a great idea. But yeah, he came in to rescue a franchising crisis, and clearly Apple was behind everyone else all the other leaders in the industry in innovating well. He was exactly where Vannevar Bush was in 1939 when he left MIT and went to Washington to rescue a franchising crisis. The military was far behind Nazi Germany and the technologies it needed to win the war, and Vannevar Bush stepped in and created a system for innovating astonishingly fast to rescue that franchising crisis. And Steve Jobs, when he came back to Apple, was brought in to rescue a franchising crisis, and what he did was create a new structure for innovating astonishingly fast, just like Vannevar Bush had done 5 decades before him. And the interesting thing is, where did that idea come from? Ultimately, both of them, consciously or not, were imitating a third person who was also brought in to rescue a franchising crisis. And in the case of Vannevar Bush, he was consciously imitating that third person.
I keep thinking here that the fear of death seems to be a governor of getting Loonshot success. I mean, being close to the edge of not surviving seems to play a role.
What happens there is that it's a motivation for trying a new structure. So obviously, since FDR in 1940 understood that we were following dangerously behind and it threatened the well-being of the country to have such a dangerous gap to our enemy, he was willing to take a chance on creating a new structure. Certainly the board of directors, when they brought in Steve Jobs the second time around, knew very well that they tried and failed to sell the company, and it was headed towards a pretty big disaster. So they were willing to experiment with whatever Jobs proposed. And that idea came from another franchise, very large franchise that was in crisis decades before World War II. So in 1907, Alexander Graham Bell had a patent on the telephone that had just expired. And the company that Alexander Graham Bell had created, called the American Telegraph and Telephone Company, or that was his eventual name, AT&T, had been milking his patent for decades and had built a monopoly based on that patent and hadn't done anything else. And since the patent had just expired around in the early 1900s, since the patent had just expired, there were all these little companies that had started to rise up, and they were just eating AT&T's lunch. And in fact, AT&T was starting to rapidly decline. Its quality was going down, its service was going down, its monopoly was going down, and all these competitors with newer technologies and better stuff and offering better service were just eating its lunch. And it was a disaster that was just headed to the ground. And there was a board of directors that were these sort of Boston Brahmins that had just been happily cashing the checks from this patent for years. And then there was a guy in New York named J.P. Morgan who was aware of the potential that AT&T had and was aware that the board had been just been trying to cash these checks and silencing innovations. So he started buying stock and eventually took control of the company and threw out the board. And he brought in a guy named Theodore Vail, who he knew and had been at AT&T decades earlier. And now he was in his 60s at the time, but he had been a leader at AT&T earlier, and he had been pounding the table to these Boston Brahmins who were on the board. So listen, we got to take this money and invest in creating new stuff. And they'd rejected him, and so he'd left and made his fortune elsewhere. So J.P. Morgan knew him, took over AT&T, threw out the board, brought in this guy named Theodore Vail. Vail took a look around and said, holy crap, this company is going to the toilet. This was like, this great telephone company that, connected the United States, and it's headed for a crash landing, just like, Vannevar Bush years later with the military and Steve Jobs years later with Apple. He said, this company is a franchise that's, headed nowhere really fast. So he said, we have to do something radical to justify our existence and to turn this around. So he got up in front of a podium and he told the newspapers, he said, we are going to connect the country. You're going to be able to call one system, one policy, one service from New York to San Francisco. And the papers were like, what? Because at the time you could barely place a phone call between, two cities in the same state. And they're like, are you serious? And so all of a sudden he came up with this kind of crazy idea, this goal of connecting the country through one system. And he kind of had to do that. He said, look, there's no reason for us to exist unless we can offer something that no one else can offer. And even people inside the company at the time thought, this is nuts. Like we can't possibly, we can barely make a phone call go, across one state. How can we go across, 3,000 miles across the country? And you have to think back that people didn't understand why signals down would fade. If you put an electrical signal in a wire and you send it down, a few miles, the signal would fade. And they couldn't explain that. The electron had just been discovered a few years earlier, and quantum mechanics, which is the physics, the science that helps you understand that, hadn't been invented yet. Quantum mechanics was 2 decades away, so no one understood even the science of it. And so he was saying something that people thought, was impossible. But he went to his board of directors and said, this is the only way we can survive. We need to create, we'll never do it with all these phone engineers, which is the equivalent of soldiers, people laying down lines and answering the phone. You need them to do that. Well, he said, we need to invent, technology that does not yet exist based on science that is not yet known. In order to do that, I need you, the board of directors, to authorize me to create this quarantine group of crazy scientists to solve this problem. So he created this group, which was eventually called Bell Laboratories, and they invented the first electronic amplifier.
They invented everything.
They invented, at the time, within a few years, they actually invented the first electronic amplifier, which is allowed 8 years later in 1915 to him to pick up the phone in New York. And he actually got Alexander Graham Bell out of retirement to his office in New York. And they put Watson, who answered the first, when they did the first phone call in the 1880s. So, he had Graham Bell here in one building in Boston and Watson at another building nearby, and said, come over here, I need you. So he had Graham Bell come up and place a phone call from New York to San Francisco, and he got Watson over to San Francisco, and Watson picked up, and Bell said, come here, Dr. Watson, I need you. And Watson said, well, it would take me a week to get to you this time. And he succeeded. And then over the next 5 decades, you had 8 Nobel Prizes, you had the transistor, you had the electronic age, you had the CCD chip, you had the first solar cell, you had so many of the great discoveries that launched the electronic age came out of Bell Labs. And that was the model for Vannevar Bush. The quarantine group of scientists working side by side with, the soldiers delivering operational excellence. And Theodore Vail saw his job not as let me tell you how to build an electronic amplifier. He saw his job as managing the touch and the balance between the artists and the soldiers. He saw his job as making both sides feel loved. Because too often there's this, especially in our culture, and especially in here, there's this praising the crazy artist or the wild innovator. And that's a mistake. What happens inside a company if the leader is going, all I really care about is the artist creating new ideas and the innovation? Well, how do the soldiers feel who are doing the real work, who are out there bringing in revenue, who's paying for the crazy artists? Well, they feel like crap. And so if you're the leader and you're pounding the table on innovation all the time, what about the soldiers? What do they think? You've just demotivated them, and you need both. And so that's what Vail preached. She said, you got to make both sides feel loved. And that is very important. And so that's what made Vannevar Bush successful decades later. In fact, the guy at the time, fast forward a few decades, the person who was a successor to Vail, who was running Bell Labs, Frank Jewett, was the guy who got Vannevar Bush to Washington. He was Vannevar Bush's mentor, and he worked closely with Vannevar Bush during the Second World War. That's one of the reasons Bush was successful, where so many other scientists had failed, because so many scientists came in with an arrogant attitude of like, well, we're scientists. We work on truth, and you guys are soldiers. You just shoot people. So you should listen to what we say because we're somehow morally superior. Not surprisingly, that attitude failed. There were lots of scientists that, came into Washington in the 1930s who recognized, like Bush did, that the U.S. was falling behind, and they had exactly zero effect. Because you're not really going to convince leaders who don't speak your language to do what you want if you don't respect them. Bush respected military men. So when he got into Washington, he had enormous respect for FDR, but he had enormous respect for the generals. He didn't think he was somehow better or worse, or his scientists or his artists were better or worse. He understood that you need both, and that you need to make both sides feel loved. Because to win a war, you need both the artists and the soldiers. If you're at a company, you need both your innovators and your people who can deliver operational excellence. You need both. Jobs, fast forwarding again, Jobs in this first version of Apple, would praise the crazy artist and completely belittled the soldiers. In fact, Steve Wozniak, who was his partner when he first started, left the company around that time, as did many others who were working on the Apple III franchise. But when he came back 12 years later, he had loved his artists and his soldiers both. And in fact, his successor was Tim Cook, the soldier, not Joni Eve, the artist.
I think you've done a great job. At least I just look at it for myself. I don't know about the audience, but for me, it's the inspiration to think about the structure, because you're right. Too much we talk about this culture or that culture, but there is a specific structure that if we want the chance to get to these phase transitions, if we want to get to the chance where there can be some percolation along the network where an idea, gets snapped up by everybody and all of a sudden it becomes the next big new thing. It starts at this ground level that we're kind of having this conversation about. It's really this yin and the yang between the two opposing forces. And I really appreciate you coming on to walk everybody through. And I think as an adjunct to this conversation, people have really got to grab the book because it's a deep dive. And I think people will really enjoy it. It goes way beyond where we've even touched in a 90-minute conversation today. But I really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
The book, Loonshots, How to Nurture the Crazy Ideas That Win Wars, Cure Diseases, and Transform Industries. Definitely cool stuff. Is there a website we can send people to?
Absolutely. Bahcall.com.
BAHCALL.com.
That's right.
I appreciate it, sir.
Thanks a lot.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, Trend Following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.